Hi, I'm Christiana Aelfson, the Education Director for the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, and thank you for coming to our presentation today. We are going to be discussing the role of Fort Missoula during World War II Japanese and Japanese American incarceration. Hopefully you caught a little bit of our videos last year and you have a background, little basic background on the fort, but if not, don't worry. I'll give you the basics and then I'll also tell you where to find more information in case we pique your interest here. So this talk is called Hawaiians, Peruvians, and West Coast Leaders, the Issei Internment at Fort Missoula. So today we're going to take the opportunity to talk about the Japanese folks who were sent to Fort Missoula for detainment during World War II. And we'll talk a little bit about the vocabulary that I'm using as we go and why we use that at Fort Missoula where it might not be appropriate otherwise. And I'll also give you my contact information. So if there's anything that you feel like you want to add or you want to help me understand better, I would love to hear from you. So let's see if I can get this screen share working and we'll talk about Fort Missoula. All right, I have found the presentation. Let's get started. What's it doing though? Okay, well, oh, there's the right button. Thank you for your patience. Okay, hopefully this is showing up all right. So one thing that we've heard from folks recently is, we often talk about the 1,200 Japanese folks who were sent to Fort Missoula. But what we know from just a little bit, digging a little bit deeper, is that they weren't a homogenous group, obviously. And we had folks from Hawaii, Peru, other places in Latin America. And then we had the West Coast leaders, which we talk about most often. So we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But first, I work for the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. We are Missoula County's historical museum. So we present on different themes that are interesting to folks who want to know about the history of Western Montana. So that includes things like agriculture and homesteading and transportation, like our locomotive there. We provide free field trips for all sorts of kiddos that live in the general area. But as you might have guessed by the title Fort Missoula, we were a fort that was established by the Army in 1877. So we also discussed the history of the fort, which is how we got to this point where we're going to be talking about Japanese internment at Fort Missoula. We have 32 acres and more than a dozen historical structures. We care for more than 45,000 historical artifacts from all kinds of different time periods. And the role of Fort Missoula during World War II is a really important story that we feel like we need to present to our visitors. We are also located on the ancestral homeland of the Salish and Kalispel people in an area of Montana that was important to many other tribes as well. So if you have any questions about Fort Missoula or anything that we talk about today, my email's down there. As you can see, it's very easy to remember. Just kidding. My last name is Icelandic, so it's hard to pronounce and harder to remember how to spell. So just a little tidbit there. If you do need to get in contact with me, you can always check on the contact me page on our website as well. Our website is fortmissoulamuseum.org, and I'll have that information at the end as well. So the early fort, as I mentioned, we were established in 1877. It was towards the end of the Indian Wars in the West, and the folks that lived in Missoula were concerned about Native American conflict, but also interested in the commerce that would come from a fort. So we have a contentious start, which deserves its own PowerPoint presentation and story. For the most part, there weren't a lot of clashes in this part of Montana, but this was the year after the Battle of Little Bighorn. So, there's a lot in the media and people were really interested in having a fort in Missoula. So to the topic at hand, we are discussing the World War II period in Missoula. And how we are connected to the larger story of Japanese and Japanese incarceration during World War II. So our camp, Fort Missoula, was actually run by the Department of Justice. So if you have some knowledge or connection to camps like Minidoka or Heart Mountain or Manzanar, those were all War Relocation Authority camps. So they were handled by two separate entities. The Department of Justice camps like us and Fort Lincoln in Bismarck and KOOSKIA in Idaho were all handled by the Department of Justice and run by the Immigration and Naturalization Services. So sometimes that seems a little bit weird. We were an Army base that was sent over to control by the INS, but if you think about it, the people who they were planning to send to Fort Missoula were generally nationals of other countries. And this included Japanese citizens, but also Germans and Italians as well. And so how these places like Fort Missoula came to be is that the government, long before Pearl Harbor, anticipated a need to house and confine potentially dangerous enemy aliens. And the law that they used is the same law that they use for Guantanamo Bay now, and that was established in the, I forget if it was 1780s or 1790s, but way back in the 1700s, to make it possible for the government to detain folks if we went to war with their country. So some things that are specific to Department of Justice camps is they run by Border Patrol agents. Our internees were arrested by the FBI, usually within days of Pearl Harbor, but sometimes up to several months later. They were subject to a loyalty hearing, and we have a separate YouTube video where you can watch a discussion about loyalty hearings. They also, the camps had to be run in accordance with the Geneva Convention, so certain levels of and quality of food and recreation had to be provided to them. We only had men at Fort Missoula, although there are a few stories about women ending up here just overnight. And most of the people who were here were considered leaders of their communities. So I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the vocabulary on this page. We tend to use the word internee and internment at Fort Missoula because the legal definitions fit what was happening at Fort Missoula. And that's been understood and accepted by folks who are smarter than me and who think a lot about words we use. But when we talk about the larger concept of the forced evacuation or forced removal of Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast and from Latin America, we'll always say incarceration and imprisonment. So if I say internment, I'm not being glib or trying to use a euphemism. It just has to do with the legal definitions of our camp. So this map, you may have seen a map similar to this. We are missing one in Washington up there. It is the greater landscape of incarceration and imprisonment during World War II. And so some of these, depending on your background, might look familiar to you. You can see Tule Lake and Manzanar and Minidoka and Heart Mountain and Amache. Those are all the green ones. So those are the War Relocation Authority camps. And so those are the ones where the majority of the 120,000 people were sent. You can also see a couple that are a different color. So you see Fort Missoula and KOOSKIA. So Fort Missoula, if you're not from Montana and you're not familiar with Montana, Montana's up there near Canada, and you can see Fort Missoula. Excuse me. And then you'll see KOOSKIA, which is in Idaho, just a bit west of Montana. There's a few other red ones on the map there. You can see Santa Fe and Crystal City. Those are some of the more well-known ones. These were all the ones that were run by Department of Justice. So the men who were sent to Fort Missoula might have cycled through some of these other camps. You'll also see some kind of orange ones, Lordsburg in New Mexico, Fort Bliss in Texas, Camp Livingston. There's also one in Oklahoma, I believe, that's missing on this map. Those are all Army camps. And so those were also part of the network that folks would have gone through if they had been processed through Fort Missoula. So the WRA camps, the big ones, they were a product of Executive Order 9066. which was established by FDR in February of 1942. So that was several months after they started bringing people to Fort Missoula. As you may know, entire families were housed at these camps, and they were hastily constructed, many American citizens, and they were sort of understood to be there for the duration. And there are many other really great presentations during Tadaima that will explain more about these individual camps. So if you're interested, I'm sure there's something on here that can let you understand the sort of lifestyle and the particular challenges at each of these camps. So why Fort Missoula? So Missoula, as you noticed on the map, we're in the internal part of the United States. We've been a fort established in 1877 and then rebuilt in the 19-teens. So we had a lot of infrastructure. And so as they were investigating different spots, they looked into Fort Missoula as being one that would take less to make it set up for several thousand potentially dangerous enemy aliens. We also had a tendency to come in and out of vogue in the Army, and so we didn't really have an important role in either of the wars, although the Student Army Training Corps in World War I, I'm sure, was very important. But we weren't strategic, I guess is a good thing to say there. So we were also federal land. So you'll notice when you look at the map of all the other camps, a lot of the camps were set on disused or less desirable parts of federal lands, often Indian reservations or Native American reservations. And I'm sure there are folks talking about that part of it during this presentation or during Tadaima as well. So, but our site had been the regional headquarters for the Civilian Conservation Corps. So during the 1930s, so we had a little extra infrastructure, good facilities for doing laundry and caring for several thousand people. So it made a lot of sense. To look on this map, hopefully you can see my arrow, but if not, you'll have to use your imagination. So if you've been out to Fort Missoula, the main museum building is right here on the west side. And then across this big square of land, if you can see a little half circle with buildings on it, and that was Officers Row. So during World War II, the Border Patrol agents would have lived there with their families. And then behind it, you'll see a whole bunch of rectangular buildings, and that's the barracks that were built at Fort Missoula to house all the Japanese, Italians, and Germans. And a lot around this sort of eastern, it's a little bit of a wonky rectangle. You can't tell so well on this map, but there was a barbed wire fence around the residential areas of the camp. So although they had some freedom of movement here, across to get to some of the other outlying buildings, when they came home at night or when they weren't doing labor on camp, they would have been behind a barbed wire fence. And then down at the bottom of the map, which would be the south side, you can see a little bit of the river and some of the sort of streams that come in there that were used for fishing at Fort Missoula during this time period. So something that's a little different from the bigger camps is we had sort of a sturdy infrastructure. So the barracks were not the tar paper shacks that you see at places like Heart Mountain. They were wooden and they had better heat. And they had things like a swimming pool and a hospital and built different facilities as well, just like they would have at the other camps. But there were just so many fewer people to take care of at Fort Missoula. They could kind of fit in existing infrastructure compared to a place like Heart Mountain that was massive. So who was sent to Fort Missoula? As I mentioned before, the idea was to house potentially dangerous enemy aliens. The first folks that came to Fort Missoula were Italian merchant seamen. And this even happened before we were at war. So it was during a time period when they wanted to find a way to help our allies without joining the war. So there was a program called the Lend-Lease Act, which meant that if we had ships from these countries that were at war with our friends, we could confiscate the ships and send them back over to England for the war effort. The problem with that is that there were thousands of men on those ships. So there was a bit of a little scheme there to keep them on the ships for long enough so that their visas expired, and then they were arrested and processed through Ellis Island, and then eventually made it to Fort Missoula in the spring of 1941. So when they got to Fort Missoula, a lot of the Italian men said, "Oh, que bella vista, what a beautiful view," because they'd already been stuck on their ships and then sent across the world, basically, or the country, to be processed. And then they land in Missoula in the spring, and it was very beautiful. The Germans, there's some statistics out there about how many Germans were arrested after Pearl Harbor, after we were actually engaged in the war. I don't have it with me, but there were quite a few. We only ended up with a couple of hundred at Fort Missoula, and most of them ended up at Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, and then Japanese nationals taken by the FBI. So I have a little asterisk there because I'm learning more as we go on. Well, we're all learning more about, the folks who were actually Issei. So they were a second generation. They'd been born in the US or born in Peru. And a handful of them, well, the Peruvians especially, ended up at Fort Missoula. So that's something we need to look into, is were the Hawaiians that were here, were they also Issei, or were they first generation and Issei? So that just is going to take some more research. But the majority of the folks who were sent to Fort Missoula were nationals. They were foreign nationals. So the men who were sent to Fort Missoula, who were Japanese or of Japanese descent, were considered potentially dangerous. So the FBI had engaged in a decade of surveillance on the Japanese and Japanese American community. And so they had an ABC list. If you were on the A list, you were considered the most dangerous. Got down to the C list, it was somebody who you were sort of noticed by the FBI, but not fully investigated yet. So some of the things that made these men potentially dangerous is that they were successful in their community. They might be business owners. They had a high profile and a lot of influence. They might have been Japanese language teachers. Sometimes it was enough that you were bilingual, so you could exist in both communities, and did a lot of translating between the European American community and the Japanese American community. You might have be a member of a suspicious organization like the Haiku Society. You could be a veteran of the Japanese Army. Maybe you were sending money back to a veterans group. Say you were in one of the earlier wars, like the Sino-Russian War, and you were drafted, you were 18, and then 2 years later you moved to the US. You spend decades here, but you still want to take care of your veterans. That would get you on the FBI's list. If you spoke out in support of Japan, which makes a little more sense. If you subscribe to Japanese language magazines, or you taught something like judo or kendo, that would all get you on their list as well. And in this photo, I kind of love this photo here. These are some of the Japanese detainees who were from Los Angeles who decided to make a golf course while they were here. So we did have slightly better conditions than some of the WRA camps, in that there was more recreation space and more resources, because we knew that people were looking at us as far as the Geneva Convention went. So we had to prove that we were providing what we wanted to be provided for our own citizens abroad, which is kind of ironic because obviously the people who were at those big WRA camps were often American citizens. But since we had Japanese citizens here, we paid more attention to, the government paid more attention to the Geneva Convention. So a lot of times when we talk about Fort Missoula, we say we had about 1,000 Italians here. They were here for the duration of the war. And we had about 1,000 Japanese and a handful of Germans. But the truth of the matter is that we had about 1,200 folks that are identified as Japanese, but they have diverse stories and histories. So thankfully, because of the partners that we work with through the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, we have great colleagues who share information with us. And as an example, this is just a little snippet here, but we have lists of folks who were being transferred to Fort Missoula from Camp Livingston. And It includes the author of the Internment Odyssey, who talks about his experience and his friends' experience in different camps. We know that picture up there in the corner. We know that we had Hawaiian folks here that played baseball. And so just from sharing information across sites, we know that although we have some generalizations about the people that were here, they had different backgrounds and different experiences going into their incarceration at Fort Missoula. So some of our generalizations are that the average age was about 60, but then some were younger. We know the story of Midori Shimoda, who we did a book talk with his daughter, so you can see that on our YouTube page. He was born in Japan, but grew up in California and ended up at Fort Missoula in his 30s. So we have some funny pictures of him. They did a play where, since he was the youngest and smallest, he got stuck in the female role for the play. So we've got some pictures of him there, but he wasn't particularly influential. He just got in trouble in Utah, and because he had a couple of cameras, he was a photographer. So he ended up here at Fort Missoula. Many were professionals, but not all. So we do have folks who worked at the fort who were pharmacists and doctors and bank officials and all sorts of things like that. We also have people like Arthur. Oh, I got to check Arthur's name before I say it wrong. Arthur Yakabi, who was from Peru, born in Peru, and had been, grew up poor and ended up in different labor jobs. And he ended up at Fort Missoula in his late 20s, I believe. So they came from all over the West Coast, so Oregon, Washington, California, some folks from Hawaii, and also from Latin America. They were sent to Fort Missoula sometimes because of mistaken identity. I've talked to some folks whose dads were here for a few weeks or a month because they had the same name as somebody who was on the FBI's list, but were a decade or two younger. Sometimes, like Arthur from Peru, they were here because someone bribed a guard to send them instead of the person they were actually looking for. And we're still learning these stories. And so one of the difficulties in telling the Fort Missoula story is that we don't have the full set of records from the time period. So we have bits and pieces that have been shared with us and found in the National Archives. And then we have everyone's stories who have come to us who said, hey, my dad's not on this list, my grandpa's not on this list, but I have this postcard from Fort Missoula, or I have this picture of him there, and then we can add them to the list. So really we appreciate the descendants and survivors of camps who are willing to share their stories and what they've heard from their parents. So Arthur Yakabi, he was taken from Peru, as I mentioned earlier. He wrote a little autobiography that's available through Densho. And it talks about his time, his trajectory through his life from being born in Peru in 1922 and ending up in New Jersey in his old age. He was he was one of the ones that I mentioned previously who he had been working in a bakery, I believe, and the FBI came to take his boss, and his boss, I would say FBI, sorry, not FBI, but the prisoners, the police came to take his boss, and the boss paid off the soldiers or the police and then took Arthur instead. He was first sent to Panama, and he stayed there for a little bit because there wasn't any room in the camps in the United States. And then he ended up in California, Fort Missoula, not in Fort Missoula for too long because he decided to go to a work camp in KOOSKIA, Idaho, and then Santa Fe, and finally in Terminal Island, where he was supposed to be deported to Japan. But then thankfully they were able to, there was a lawyer who interjected and he was able to get his freedom and work in New Jersey. So I'll backtrack a little bit here because this is definitely an interesting story that's a little different from the ones that we're more familiar with. Along with taking folks from the West Coast and Hawaii, the US government decided that they needed prisoners for a prisoner exchange. They didn't want to send Japanese Americans because they were afraid that if they sent them to Japan, that they would share information with the Japanese government. So they came to an agreement with several governments on the west coast of South America for the Navy to come in and to kidnap basically Latin American folks of Japanese descent and use them as prisoner exchanges. This is another big story that I'm sure there are other folks telling, but we're just getting into it because we realized that we had several hundred, or at least 100 Latin American Japanese at Fort Missoula. So it provides a totally different story. You know, their first languages were Japanese and Spanish, so they came to the United States without any English and having to figure out all of this that was going on. So it's definitely worth exploring. There are a few books about this time period and these people who were taken from Peru as well. And we hope at Fort Missoula that this is another story that we'll be able to flesh out and to talk more about in the future. I wanted to talk a little bit about the KOOSKIA connection because a lot of the Japanese and Hawaiian folks, a lot of the Latin American and Hawaiian folks that were at Fort Missoula chose to transfer to KOOSKIA. KOOSKIA was a work camp, and it was a place where they were building Highway 12. So many records are available from this time period, which helps us understand the living conditions there and their connection to Fort Missoula. And there's a great book called Imprisoned in Paradise that's about the KOOSKIA story. A lot of the younger internees ended up there because it was a way to make money and to not be bored, basically. So it's definitely an interesting sort of tangent to go off on. So back to our incarcerated individuals at Fort Missoula. So we've talked about a little bit about the Hawaiians and the Peruvians. And then we also had the majority of the folks that were at Fort Missoula were West Coast Japanese gentlemen. So one of the more famous ones, and one that we know a lot about because the Issei family is so good at sharing their stories and have created a lot of literature and documentaries about this time period. So we know a lot about Masuo Yasui. He was a prominent Hood River orchardist. He's in that picture there getting an award from the Consul of Japan. He was a Rotarian and a Methodist, and kind of, if you think about the American dream of an immigrant coming in and adopting sort of Western culture and becoming successful, he's one of those guys. He also just fostered just excellent commerce between the European American folks and the Japanese American folks in Hood River, Oregon. But it was an area that was heavily anti-Japanese, and it had to do with racism and economics. And so as soon as there was a chance, people were basically trying to throw him at the wolves and say that he was an ally of Japan. So from Fort Missoula, he went through a loyalty hearing where he had to prove that he was not disloyal to the United States. And then he was sent to Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, and finally Santa Fe, New Mexico over the course of three years. He was even kept in the camp until months after the war was over. And this may have something to do with the fact that his son, Min Yasui, was questioning the constitutionality of the Curfew Act, or the curfew law that was keeping Japanese Americans under curfew, even though they were citizens. So there was some animosity towards his family by the FBI. So this little map here is just using the Yasui family as an example of how pulled apart people's families were. This brown sort of arrow or brown trajectory here is Masuo Yasui. So they all started in Hood River, except for the eldest, who was in Illinois at the time. And so Mr. Yasui was taken shortly after Pearl Harbor, ended up at Fort Missoula, and then you can see his eventual path to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And all these other colors here are all of his children. So he had children that were in high school and college, and had, the youngest went to Tule Lake with their mom, and then some of the other ones ended up at different work camps in Great Falls and in Idaho. And then also everybody else ended up kind of reuniting in Denver. And he and his wife ended up in Oregon at the end, or towards the end of their lives, but they never went back to Hood River because it just wasn't welcoming to them. But this family separation is just a really important story to tell with our internees. So what happened after the war? So to the Japanese men, what happened to them, and what happened to Fort Missoula? So the Fort Missoula part's a little easier. So Fort Missoula ended up being turned back over to the Army, and they were it was turned over to the Army, and then it became a prison for court-martialed Army guys. And then to the Japanese men who were incarcerated here, that's a bigger story. So that is something that we're learning, you know, as you saw with Mr. Issei, the trajectory after Fort Missoula could have been many different things. So after they went through a loyalty hearing, they might have been sent just straight to Heart Mountain where their families were, or whichever WRA camp. Or you could end up like Mr. Issei, where you were deemed still too dangerous. And so you were interned for the duration of the war and then beyond, and you got sent from camp to camp, which I'm sure was incredibly difficult for their physical stamina and also just emotional state, being separated from their families for that long. So this is my plea to you. We only know what we know because of the help of descendants and some excellent researchers. So if you have information about a relative who was at Fort Missoula, you can contact me. There's my information there, or you can contact our curator, Emma. And you can also go to our website and go through the contact us or share your story button there. And what's next for us? Well, we are lucky that we received a JAX grant for barracks reconstruction. So you can see one of the former barracks from Fort Missoula, that brown building there. We have two of them actually that will be restored, and one will be used for collection storage, climate controlled, and then the other one will help us further sort of flesh out the story of internment at Fort Missoula. And we're looking forward to being able to show you what the inside of the barracks looked like for both the Italians and the Japanese that were here. And this was just a tidbit, just a little sort of introduction to how Fort Missoula fits into this greater incarceration landscape. So if you want to go back, and we have a 30-minute documentary and a site tour and a slideshow and a discussion about the loyalty hearings, you can look at last year's Tadaima. I think we were on July 15th last year, or you can go to YouTube and search Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, and you should be able to get to all those videos there. Also, feel free to reach out to me at the fort. I'm happy to send you direct links to things as well. So some more contact information there just in case. We love giving tours. We love sharing information with visitors. So if you are coming out to Fort Missoula, passing through, give us a call a few days ahead of time, or send me an email, and we'd love to show you around some places that are not necessarily accessible to the public, but might be of interest to you. And then finally, thank you to the folks at Tadaima for including us again this year, and to all of our partners who so willingly share information with us and help us tell the story of Fort Missoula and this larger story of Japanese and Japanese American internment during World War II. I'm happy to talk. If anybody has questions, feel free to send me an email, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual pilgrimage. I look forward to seeing all of these wonderful programs, and hope to see you at Fort Missoula sometime.